March 8, 1970. Lyons Drag Strip, California. Don Garlits' dragster explodes at 200 miles per hour. The transmission detonates like a bomb, cutting the swamp rat 13 in half, and taking part of his right foot with it. 9 months later, he'd return with a car so revolutionary that within 18 months, every single front-engine dragster in America would be obsolete. NHRA didn't ban it. They didn't have to. The old design just couldn't compete anymore. Today, we're counting down 5 engines and innovations that were so dominant, so revolutionary, or so dangerous that NHRA had no choice but to change the rules permanently. From a grocery getter that humiliated Hemis, to a Japanese engine NHRA literally couldn't figure out how to classify, to the safety breakthrough that saved countless lives. Some of these rule changes are still in effect today. 50 years later. Welcome back to Regal Rides, where we dig into the real stories behind classic American muscle and drag racing history. I'm your host, and today's episode? This one's special. We're not talking about the fastest cars or the biggest engines. We're talking about the innovations that were so effective, so dominant, or so dangerous that NHRA had absolutely no choice but to change the rules. Some of these changes were about safety. Some were about keeping competition fair. And some? Well, some were just because nobody could figure out how to classify what these mad geniuses had built. Over the next 25 minutes, we're covering 5 major innovations from 1970 to 2005. The real stories behind the rule changes. The technical details that made them special. How these moments shaped modern drag racing. And why some of these rules still exist today. Before we fire up, if you're into drag racing history, classic muscle, and the stories they don't tell you at the track, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're bringing you deep dive content every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. To understand why these rule changes mattered, you need to understand where NHRA was between 1970 and 2005. This was drag racing's most innovative era, and its most dangerous. Late 1960s, early 1970s. Top fuel dragsters were running what they called the slingshot design. Front-engine cars with the driver sitting behind a 1500 horsepower nitro motor, literally straddling the transmission and clutch. When these cars were hauling down the strip at 220 miles per hour and something went wrong. The driver was in the blast zone. Mike Sorokin. John, the zookeeper, Mulligan. Others. 6 top fuel drivers killed in just 2 years between 1969 and 1970. Mulligan died after a clutch fire following a 6.43-second qualifying run at the '69 U.S. Nationals. At the 1970 Nationals, Jim Nicholls' car was literally sawed in half during the final round. He survived, but barely. Meanwhile, 1970 marked the debut of Pro Stock, the factory hot rod class. Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin were dominating with their Hemi Plymouth. These were big block muscle cars making 9-second passes, and they still looked relatively stock. Production bodies. Factory suspension. Weight around 3,000 pounds with 426, 427 cubic inch engines under the hood. But it didn't stay that way for long. By the mid-1970s, racers were pushing every boundary of the word stock. Acid-dipping bodies to shed weight. Tube frame chassis. Experimental engines. NHRA was struggling to maintain any kind of stock identity for these classes. The sport was exploding with innovation, and NHRA was scrambling to keep up. Then the 1980s and 90s brought the speed problem. Nitro cars approaching 300 miles per hour. Safety technology racing to keep pace with power technology. And NHRA realized they couldn't just let this thing run unchecked. Here's what people don't understand about NHRA. They're not just trying to make exciting racing. They're trying to keep people alive. But they also can't kill innovation, or the sport dies. It's a constant balancing act, and there's no perfect answer. Every rule change in this video came from one of 3 motivations. First, safety-mandated changes. These happen after deaths or serious injuries. No mech suits, parachutes, roll cages, fire suppression systems. When safety is on the line, NHRA acts decisively and absolutely. These rarely generate controversy because, well, nobody wants to see people die. Second, parity-based changes. These happen when one manufacturer or one team dominates so completely that competition suffers. Weight breaks, displacement limits, boost restrictions. These are always controversial because someone always asks, are we punishing innovation? Are we punishing success? Third, cost control. NHRA tries to limit exotic materials and technologies to prevent an arms race that prices out regular competitors. Bore spacing limits. Specific fuel regulations. Material restrictions. The goal is keeping the sport accessible. The reality? Innovation costs money, and slowing innovation means slowing costs. Every rule change in this video fits one of these three categories. And in every single case, somebody felt they were being unfairly targeted. Because here's the thing, when you build something revolutionary, when you find that edge nobody else thought of, and then they change the rules, that hurts. So what makes an innovation so significant that NHRA has to step in? For our list today, we're looking at three factors. 1. Immediate dominance. Did it win right away? Could competitors respond without adopting the same innovation themselves? If everyone has to copy you to compete, you've changed the game. 2. Permanent rules created. Did NHRA implement lasting changes because of this? Are those rules still in effect today, decades later? Temporary rule adjustments don't make our list. We're talking about changes that fundamentally altered how a class operates. 3. Shift in philosophy. Did it change how an entire class approaches racing? Did it force industry-wide innovation or adaptation? The best examples are the ones where you can draw a clear line. Before this innovation, racing looked like this. After? It looked like that. The 5 innovations we're covering today all meet these criteria. Some were safety breakthroughs that saved lives and changed the fundamental design of race cars forever. Others were so dominant they made entire classes of cars obsolete overnight. And one was so confusing that NHRA literally couldn't figure out how to classify it, so they just removed it from the rulebook entirely. Let's start with the one that changed everything. The innovation that made front-engine dragsters extinct within 18 months. The safety breakthrough that's still saving lives 50 years later. Don Garlits and the rear-engine revolution. By 1970, Top Fuel had a death problem. The front-engine slingshot design put drivers right behind 1,500 horsepower of nitromethane fury. They sat there straddling the transmission, the clutch, and the entire drivetrain. When things went wrong at 220 miles per hour, and they went wrong often, the driver was sitting in the blast zone. March 8, 1970. Lions drag strip in the Long Beach area. Don Garlits, already a legend, already Big Daddy, was testing an experimental 2-speed transmission in his Swamp Rat 13. At launch, the transmission exploded. Just detonated like a bomb. It cut the car in half ahead of the cockpit, severed part of his right foot, and broke his left leg. The front half of the car was just gone. Garlits later said he remembered looking down and seeing his foot missing, and his first thought was, well, I guess I'm done racing. He wasn't done. While recovering in the hospital, Garlits read an article by E.K. von Delden in Hot Rod magazine called New Concepts in Fuelers. One sentence stuck with him. How the driver got behind these components in the first place is an easy question to answer, but what keeps him there isn't? That sentence changed drag racing forever. Garlits started sketching. What if you move the engine behind the driver? Put the driver in front of all mechanical components? Protected from fires, explosions, debris? The idea wasn't entirely new, some guys had tried it. But nobody had made it work at the national level. His design used a 217-inch wheelbase, same as his slingshot cars. But now the driver sat up front. Engine out back. Long drive shaft connecting them. The weight over the rear tires actually helped traction. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice? Nobody knew. The steering geometry would be completely different. The weight distribution unfamiliar. And the entire drag racing establishment thought he was crazy. They called it Fulton's Folly, a reference to the steamship inventor everyone laughed at. The magazines were already writing articles about the obvious disadvantages of rear-engine design. March 8, 1971. Exactly 1 year after the accident, Don Garlits returned to Lions drag strip with his rear-engine Swamp Rat 14. Same track. Same lane where he'd been injured. His first race back. He lost. Gary Cochran beat him. The car was unstable at high speed. Something was wrong with the handling. His sponsors were pressuring him to abandon the project. His crew was frustrated. And every magazine in the country was saying, see? We told you it wouldn't work. But Garlits and his crew chief T.C. Lemons didn't quit. They figured out the problem wasn't the concept, it was the steering. Rear-engine cars needed a slower steering ratio than slingshots. The weight distribution was so different that the quick steering everyone was used to was actually making the car unstable. They sorted it out. At Pomona, at the 1971 Winter Nationals, Garlits and the Swamp Rat 14 ran consistent low 6.70-second passes. He defeated an entire field of front-engine cars. First rear-engine national event win in NHRA history. In August 1971, he won again at Bakersfield. This wasn't a fluke. This was the future. And everyone in drag racing knew it. Within months, other teams started building rear-engine cars. Don Prudhomme, another legend, had briefly quit after Jim Nichols' accident. He came back, with a rear-engine design. By the end of 1972, most top teams were switching. The last front-engine car to win a national event did it in August 1972, less than 18 months after Garlits' Winter Nationals victory. By 1974, front-engine dragsters were extinct in professional racing. Here's what's fascinating. NHRA didn't ban front-engine dragsters. They didn't have to. The design was simply obsolete. Safer and faster. Within 18 months, if you showed up with a front-engine car, you were done. Market forces made the change, not rule books. Today, every dragster from top fuel to pro level to junior dragster uses a rear-engine layout. Front-engine designs only exist in nostalgia racing, where they belong. This innovation has saved countless lives over 50-plus years. How many drivers would have died in transmission explosions, clutch fires, driveline failures if we'd kept running slingshots? We'll never know, but it's a lot. Don Garlits once said, "Other than the museum, that's the thing I'm most proud of. Not his championships. Not his records. Not his 270 national event wins. The innovation that saved lives. That's Big Daddy's real legacy." Now let's talk about the grocery getter that killed the muscle car era. 1970, Pro Stock debuts as NHRA's newest class. The factory hot rod class. And immediately, Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin's Hemi Plymouth starts dominating. The 426 Hemi against 427 big blocks from Chevy and Ford. But Chrysler had something nobody else did: factory backing. Unlimited budgets. The best engineers. The fastest development. Bill "Grumpy" Jenkins, already a legend as an engine builder, won the first 2 pro stock races ever at the 1970 Winter Nationals and Gator Nationals. He went winless through the entire 1971 season. Chrysler factory teams with unlimited money were crushing everyone. Pro stock was dying from lack of competition. Jenkins could either try to outspend Chrysler's factory teams, or he could outsmart them. At the end of 1971, NHRA competition director Steve Gibbs made a decision that would change pro stock forever. New rule for 1972, small block wedge engines would run at 6.75 pounds per cubic inch. Big block engines, including the Hemi, would run at 7.25 pounds per cubic inch. That made small blocks more than 200 pounds lighter. NHRA was trying to restore competition. They were trying to save the class. Bill Jenkins saw an opportunity. November 1971. Jenkins had 2 months to build a car for the 1972 Winter Nationals. He chose the Chevrolet Vega, an economy car so notoriously bad it's considered one of the worst cars ever made. Aluminum engine blocks that warped. Bodies that rusted in the showroom. But Jenkins didn't care about reliability or comfort. He cared about one thing: power-to-weight ratio. His plan was radical. A 331 cubic inch small block, basically a bored-out 327. The first tube frame chassis in pro stock history, running from the firewall back. Acid-dipped body panels to shed every possible ounce. Expandable foam injected into critical areas for structure. This was a panel pro stocker. It looked like a production car, but underneath, pure race car. Final weight, around 2,400 pounds. Compare that to 2,900 plus for the Hemi cars. His small block made 580, maybe 585 horsepower. Less than the Hemis. But 500 pounds lighter means you don't need more power. The risk was enormous. Completely untested design. No time for development. The Chrysler teams had years of refinement. Jenkins was gambling everything on 2 months of fabrication and a weight break rule. 1,400 man-hours in 8 weeks. Jenkins, Larry Trison, Dick Whitman, Tom Kerr. Working around the clock. The car was delivered to Pomona just days before the Winter Nationals. They'd have one shakedown run. One chance to get it right. Jenkins later said, "I was going to build it whether NHRA went with weight breaks or not. I could have used it for match races. But now he had a rule that might actually let him win." 1972 Winter Nationals. Pomona, California. Bill Jenkins rolled the untested Vega to the starting line for qualifying. Disaster. The suspension setup was all wrong. He qualified with a 9.90 second pass. 17th position out of 32 cars. First round? Billy Meyer's Hemi Duster with Stu McDade driving. Nobody gave Jenkins a chance. The magazines were already writing about how the weight brake rule didn't matter because the Hemis were still dominant. Then race day happened. Overnight, Jenkins and his crew figured out the suspension. On Sunday morning, that Vega came alive. He ran low, 9.60s in eliminations. Defeated 5 Hemi-powered cars. Round by round. In the final, he beat Don Garlits' Hemi. The look on everyone's faces, this Vega, this economy car, this grocery getter, just beat every Hemi in the field. It wasn't even close. The 1972 season? Jenkins won 6 out of 8 NHRA national events. Earned $250,000, matching Wilt Chamberlain as one of the highest-paid athletes in America. He was featured in Time magazine. First drag racer ever. In 1973, he set Pro Stock's first official speed record, 148.76 miles per hour. And through the 1972 season, he made 250 consecutive shifts without missing a single one. Perfect execution. The Vega proved that lighter and smarter beats bigger and more expensive. Every time. Within 2 years, every Pro Stock was a tube frame car. The era of actually stock Pro Stock was over. By 1974, Jenkins had evolved the concept further. Grumpy's Toy 11, his new Vega, had a full tube frame chassis. McPherson's strut front suspension, the first in Pro Stock. Dry sump oiling system, also a first. 3-link rear suspension. Dana 60 rear end. Lenco 4-speed planetary transmission. That 331 cubic inch engine was now making 680 horsepower at 9,300 revolutions per minute. It only looked like a Vega. Nothing else was stock. Not the chassis. Not the suspension. Not the drivetrain. Nothing. NHRA didn't explicitly ban stock chassis. They just stopped pretending. Pro Stock became what it still is today, purpose-built race cars that look like production cars. That's the formula. That's what Jenkins created. His innovation paved the way for Bob Glidden, Lee Shepard, Warren Johnson. Small block dominance continued for decades. 13 NHRA national event wins for Jenkins. Grumpy's Toy X, the 1972 Winter Nationals winner, was later restored by Mark Pappas and sold at auction in 2007 for $577,500. Most expensive Vega ever built. Bill Jenkins died in 2012 at age 82. But his legacy lives on every time a Pro Stock car rolls to the starting line. They're all tube frame cars now. They all use the formula Jenkins pioneered. The grocery getter that changed everything. Now let's talk about the engine that was so weird, NHRA couldn't figure out how to classify it. So they just removed it from the rulebook. Before we go further, you need to understand what a Wankel rotary engine is. Unlike a piston engine with cylinders that go up and down, a rotary uses spinning triangular rotors inside oval-shaped chambers. Smaller, lighter, and weird. Really weird. Here's NHRA's problem. Traditional piston engines are measured in cubic inches of displacement. But rotaries? How do you measure displacement? Do you count rotor volume? Chamber volume? The power characteristics are completely different from a piston engine. Different power band. Different torque curve. There's no established baseline for comparison. One NHRA official said in 1980, "It's like trying to compare apples to alien spacecraft." And then Terry Hord showed up with a 4-rotor Mazda. Terry Hord started in Modified Eliminator, an index-based class. His 4-rotor Mazda engine in an RX-3 body was originally classified in C/Modified Compact. He was supposed to run against naturally aspirated 4-cylinder imports. Honda Civics. Toyota Corollas. You know, economy cars. Hord didn't just beat them. He destroyed them. So NHRA moved him to a higher class. He still dominated. They added weight. He still won. By early 1980, NHRA officials admitted publicly they had no clue how to classify a Wankel against piston engines. They put him in AA/Modified Compact, forcing him to run against turbocharged 4-cylinders. Buddy Ingersoll's Turbo Pinto was the killer in that class. Hord's rotary was naturally aspirated. No blower. No turbo. Just 4 spinning rotors. He still won. NHRA kept adding weight. Reports say they added maybe half a ton total over the years. Nothing worked. The rotary's power characteristics were just too different. Too smooth. too unlike anything they could balance against piston engines. At the end of 1981, NHRA killed the entire modified Eliminator class. Cars were redistributed to competition Eliminator or Super Stock. Most of them found new homes. But the rotary? NHRA just didn't include it in either rulebook. Read that again. They eliminated an entire class rather than keep dealing with Terry Horde's Mazda. NHRA was so tired of chasing this thing, they simply wrote the combination out of the rulebook. Not because it was too powerful, because they literally couldn't figure out how to make it fair. No equitable method to compare Wankels to pistons. Different power bands. Different torque curves. Can't handicap accurately. So rather than keep guessing, rather than keep adding weight and hoping something sticks, they just excluded it. Today, rotaries still aren't accepted in conventional NHRA classes. Demetrius Demeris runs a rotary in sport compact racing under different sanctioning. But in NHRA? To this day, nobody has developed what they consider an equitable method of classification. Here's the irony. In 1991, Mazda won the 24 Hours of Le Mans with a rotary engine. Beat Ferrari. Beat Porsche. Beat everyone. Only Japanese manufacturer to ever win Le Mans. But in NHRA? Too complicated to classify. Sometimes the most innovative engine isn't banned for being too fast. Sometimes it's banned for being too weird. 1969 to 1970. NASCAR. The Boss 429 Ford was built for one reason, to beat Chrysler's Hemi. Semi-hemispherical heads. Massive valves. And here's the key, 4.9 inches of bore spacing, measuring from center to center of each cylinder. Only 859 Boss 429 Mustangs were built for homologation. Today they're worth $500,000 or more. But in NHRA? The Boss 429 was legal in various classes for decades. That 4.9-inch bore spacing was always within the rules. It was heavier than typical small blocks, so it mostly lived in top alcohol classes. Nobody had a problem with it. For 35 years. Then the Austin family decided to build a new one. Pat Austin, four-time NHRA top alcohol funny car champion. His father Walt Austin, legendary engine builder out of Tacoma for 50 years. In 2004, they started a project. A modern interpretation of the Boss 429 for alcohol funny car. Within existing rules. Using that same 4.9-inch bore spacing that had been legal since the 1960s. The Austins realized something, that wider bore spacing allowed for thicker cylinder sleeves. More stable block under stress. Better cooling. More reliable at high RPM. Effectively, a more user-friendly big-bore engine. Everything was within the existing rules. They weren't cheating. They were innovating. Word spread early in the year. NHRA requested blueprints. Late March, letters went out to racers. New rule, effective 2005. Maximum bore spacing 4.84 inches. 0.06-inch reduction. Specifically targeted at the Boss 429. The Austin family was blindsided. Greg Hunter, a Canadian racer, had a 2-year project ruined overnight. A petition circulated at the Las Vegas Divisional. NHRA officials wouldn't explain the reasoning. Finally, unofficial word came out, stem rising costs. Prevent a new arms race in alcohol classes. Keep competitive balance. Level playing field. Pat Austin's response showed remarkable restraint. I'm not angry at anybody. It's their playground, and they make the rules. But here's what happened. Boss 429 development ended. The engine became a paperweight. Innovation in alcohol funny car was stifled. And the debate reignited. Cost control versus innovation. Where's the line? The Boss 429 ban shows NHRA prioritizing cost control over technological advancement. And maybe that's necessary. Maybe letting the Austin family build what would have been the dominant engine would have forced everyone else to spend $250,000 on Boss 429 builds just to compete. Maybe that prices out the small teams. Or maybe it just punishes the guys smart enough to find the edge. Here's the interesting epilogue. In 2016, NHRA announced a similar ban on large bore spacing engines in Pro Mod. Racers protested. The financial impact would have been devastating for teams who'd already invested hundreds of thousands. And you know what happened? NHRA retracted the rule. After 1 week. Proving that sometimes when racers push back united, they can win. But in 2005, the Austin family's Boss 429 stayed banned. It's still banned today. Bore spacing limits remain at 4.84 inches in most classes. Now let's talk about the speed problem. And the fuel that created it. Nitromethane. Rocket fuel for cars. It produces 2.4 times the power of gasoline for the same volume of air. But it's also incredibly violent. The more nitro you run, the more power you make, and the more stress you put on every single component. 1964, Don Garlits becomes the first to 200 miles per hour. 1975, he's first to 250. Through the 1980s, speeds stagnate. Safety catches up a bit. But late 1980s into the early 1990s? Rapid escalation. By 1991, the best speed was 293.15 miles per hour. 300 was coming. Everyone knew it. March 20th, 1992. 4:44 p.m. Gainesville Raceway, Florida. Kenny Bernstein and crew chief Dale Armstrong in the Budweiser King Top Fuel dragster. They'd been working on this all weekend. Wes Cerny, who'd worked with Roland Leong, brought critical cylinder head knowledge. They modified the magnetos between races. Everything was dialed in. The run, 4.823 seconds. 301.70 miles per hour. Here's the crazy part. The engine dropped a cylinder 200 feet before the finish line. 7 cylinders. And it still went over 300. Bernstein won $50,000 from the Slick 50 bonus program. But more importantly, he broke what everyone thought was the final barrier. He later said, "That was the last barrier this sport may see. The next barrier may be broken long after we're gone." He had no idea speeds would keep climbing. But speed kept climbing. By the late 1990s, teams were pushing nitro percentage closer to 100%. More nitro equals more power. It also equals more stress. And by 1999, engines were coming apart violently. Engine blocks couldn't handle the loads. Catastrophic failures were increasing. Debris was endangering drivers, crew members, spectators. Something had to give. 1999, NHRA implemented a mandatory maximum. 90% nitromethane, remainder methanol. The 90% rule. Impact was immediate. Power reduction. Safer engine operation. Slowed speed escalation at least temporarily. Every team had to completely retune. Crew chiefs who'd spent years learning how to run 95%, 98% nitro? Start over. But the sport got safer. Engines lasted longer between rebuilds. Catastrophic failures decreased. Debris incidents decreased. NHRA had drawn a line. We will not let technology run unchecked. Today's top fuel and funny car rules still reflect that 1999 decision. 90% nitro maximum. But that's not the only restriction. Minimum gear ratio, 3.20 to 1. Prevents excessive top-end speed. Maximum displacement, 500 cubic inches. Maximum clutch discs, 6. And in 2008, after Scott Kalida's tragic death, NHRA shortened the distance from a quarter mile to 1,000 feet. Current records are approaching 340 miles per hour in 1,000 feet. If they were still running the quarter mile, they'd be exceeding 350. NHRA learned they couldn't let technology run unchecked. The goal isn't to see how fast cars can go. It's to see the fastest they can go safely. Safety technology is barely keeping pace as it is. Don Garlits has an interesting perspective. Big Daddy suggested returning to a 70/30ths nitro to methanol ratio and banning rev limiters. He feels 300 miles per hour quarter-mile racing could return with better safety equipment. But here's the trade-off. Every restriction makes racing safer. Every restriction also limits innovation. Where do you draw the line? That's the question NHRA faces every single season. And there's no perfect answer. Looking at these 5 examples, a pattern emerges. First, safety trumps everything. Garlits' rear-engine design saved countless lives. Nitro restrictions prevented deaths. When safety is on the line, NHRA acts decisively. And eventually, the racing community accepts it. Because nobody wants to see people die. Second, parity versus innovation. This is where controversy lives. Jenkins Vega benefited from weight breaks to restore competition. The Boss 429 was banned for cost control. The rotary couldn't be classified, so it was excluded. These decisions generate the most debate because someone always asks, are we punishing success? Are we punishing innovation? Third, unintended consequences. The rear-engine design didn't just make front-engine cars obsolete. It changed the entire sport's philosophy about driver safety. Jenkins' tube frame didn't just help him win. It ended stock, pro stock forever. The rotary ban didn't just exclude Horde. It prevented all exotic engine development. Every rule creates a new strategic landscape. NHRA walks a tightrope. Too many restrictions kill innovation. Too few restrictions kill racers or bankrupt competitors. There's no perfect answer. Just constant adjustment. These rules aren't ancient history. They're still in effect today. Every single dragster from top fuel to junior dragster uses rear-engine design. Garlits' 1971 innovation is mandatory now. Front engine only exists in nostalgia racing. Every pro stock car is tube frame construction. Jenkins' 1972 innovation is the standard. Stock is purely cosmetic. Rotaries still aren't classified in conventional NHRA classes. That 1981 decision stands. Bore spacing remains limited to 4.84 inches in most classes. The 2005 Boss 429 ban is permanent. And nitro restrictions continue. 90% maximum, 3.20 to 1 gear ratio minimum, 1,000-foot distance for nitro cars. These rules keep evolving as speeds climb. Modern racing is dominated by megateams. John Force Racing, Kalitta Motorsports, Don Schumacher Racing. Single-car teams like Kenny Bernstein's can't compete anymore. That's partly why he retired. The rules favor scale now. But that scale requires massive budgets. Technology restrictions continue. Computer-controlled systems are limited. Traction control is prohibited. Pro Mod has specific ECU requirements. NHRA keeps trying to slow innovation to control costs. The question is always the same. How much restriction is enough? How much is too much? The pro-innovation argument goes like this. Drag racing was built on innovation. Guys in garages finding edges. When NHRA restricts too much, racing becomes a spec series. Where's the creativity? Where's the ingenuity? The pro-restriction argument counters. Without rules, you get an arms race. The richest teams win. Speeds become dangerous. The sport prices out regular racers. Somebody has to maintain balance. Recent controversies prove this debate is alive. That 2016 Pro Mod bore spacing reversal showed racers can win if they unite. Electronic aids debates are ongoing. Cost control versus performance. Accessibility versus technology advancement. The old-timers have opinions. Garlits wants slower cars for safety. Jenkins' legacy proved that lighter and smarter beats bigger and more expensive. Bernstein admitted single-car teams can't compete in the modern megateam era. As speeds continue climbing, as technology advances, NHRA will keep making adjustments. Some will be controversial. Some will save lives. All will be debated by people like us, at tracks and online, forever. Here's the fundamental question these 5 moments force us to ask. Should drag racing be about who's fastest or who's smartest? Who's richest or who's most innovative? Who builds the best car or who finds the best loophole? NHRA has been struggling with that question for 50 years. They're still struggling today. And they'll be struggling 50 years from now. 3 things to take away from this. 1. Innovation drives racing forward. Garlits' rear-engine design saved the sport from a death spiral. Jenkins proved that creativity beats budget. But innovation without boundaries gets people killed. The balance is everything. 2. Rules reflect priorities. Safety rules are immediate and absolute. Parity rules are controversial and debated. Cost control rules are the most divisive. But they all tell you what NHRA values most: life, fairness, and accessibility. 3. Legacy lasts generations. These 5 moments still shape racing today. Rules from 50 years ago are still in effect. Modern racers compete under regulations born from these innovations. History matters. Here's the irony. Every one of these innovators was fighting against the establishment. Then their innovations became the establishment. Jenkins' tube frames? That's the standard now. Garlits' rear engine? Can't race without it. The rebels became the rulebook. Here's my question for you. If you could go back and change one of these rule changes, which would it be? Would you let rotaries run and see what happened? Remove bore spacing limits? Let nitro cars run unlimited? Or do you think NHRA got it right? Drop your answer in the comments. And here's a harder question. What current innovation do you think will force a rule change in the next 5 years? Electric dragsters? AI-controlled clutches? Something we haven't even thought of yet? I want to hear your predictions. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of racing fan we're making this content for. Subscribe and hit that bell notification. We've got more deep dive drag racing history coming every single week. Follow us on Instagram at Regal Rides for behind the scenes content and daily drag racing history. We post photos of these legendary cars that you won't find anywhere else. And hey, if you've got stories about these cars, these racers, or if you were there for any of these moments, please share in the comments. The community knowledge in these comment sections is incredible. Racing is about pushing boundaries. Sometimes those boundaries push back. These 5 innovations show what happens when unstoppable force meets immovable rules. Thanks for watching Regal Rides. We'll see you at the track.